Ah, so here we are, about to read the weekly portion of Parasha, where it tells a story about Avraham sending his servant to find a bride for his son, for Yitzchak. And his servant goes all the way from the area of Hebron where Avraham is living, and he goes all the way to Haran, far, far away, up somewhere near in the area of northern Turkey. And he goes and we all know the story, how he ends up finding Rivka. The interesting thing about this week's Parsha is usually the Torah is very, very careful about every word. Every word is important. Whoever, the darshanim, the people who sit and say, why was this extra word written twice, or this extra letter, every letter has significance. And suddenly in this week's Parsha, the story of the servant of Avraham appears again and again and again. Because it happens once, as it happens, and then he tells the story, and he tells it again. Sometimes it repeats itself almost 3 times. And we look and we try to understand. Usually the Torah is so careful, and here these stories take up half of the Parsha. Another interesting thing is a concept that appears here in the first time called Kfitzat HaDerech. I'm not going to get too much into it. It literally means the jumping of the road. When the servant of Avraham, when he makes it to Haran, he says, Va'avo hayom el ha'ayin, and I came today to the well. And they say, why does he say today? It teaches us that he left today and he arrived today. Now we all know that the journey from Hebron all the way up to Haran doesn't take a day. So Rashi brings a midrash and he says, Melamed shekafza lo haderech. We learn that he had this jumping of the road, that suddenly you think a journey is going to take a certain amount of time, but in a second, suddenly it's like the earth suddenly folded itself up. He took one step from one side of the world, from Israel, took one step, and in the same day he arrived at Haran. Okay, so that's an interesting thing. It's a miracle. And right after that, the same Rashi, the same Midrash, he brings something interesting where he says, in the name of Rabbi Acha, Ma Rabbi Acha, Yafa sichatan shel avdei avot mitoratan shel banim. The stories of the slaves, of the servants, of the avot, of our ancestors, of our patriarchs, are greater than the Torah of the children. And where do we learn this from? Because exactly what I said, that in the Torah everybody's very careful about not using too many words, and here suddenly we're telling a story, and we can see that the story itself has more weight. It takes us a longer way. In essence, all of Bereshit, the whole book of Bereshit is filled with stories. So what is it about this tension between stories and between learning Torah? So the Baal Shem Tov, he takes these two seemingly unconnected things and he says, I want you to know that the secret, you want to make the road jump, you want to have Kfitzat HaDerech, the secret is in this verse itself and in the story itself. And if you listen very closely, it's not that if I say this pasuk with the right kavanah, with the right intention, I can suddenly appear on the other side of the world. That would be nice, wouldn't it? But that there's something in the stories we tell that enable us to go on a journey or to arrive somewhere quicker than the regular way. And this is something I want to talk about for a second. In the world we live in, we go to school, we study for 12 years, we go to university, we go to yeshiva, we get our BA, MA, doctorate, postdoctorate. These things take time. Learning things with our head takes time. But there are shortcuts. What are the shortcuts? The shortcuts are that sometimes we can learn something, I wouldn't say the easy way, but through a different path. Because when I learn something intellectually, it takes me a certain amount of time. But when I hear a story, something else happens. It's magical. When I tell stories, I'm a bit of a storyteller myself. When I tell stories, it doesn't matter if the crowd is a bunch of 3-year-olds or 93-year-olds. There's that moment when I'm telling a story that everybody's listening, their mouth is a little bit opened, their eyes are open with wonder, and their heart is wide opened. When we hear a story, we identify with the person who's going through, who's on this journey, and we go with him, journeys that take us halfway across the world without even leaving our chair. That's the power of stories. Reb Nachman believed in stories. When the whole world said, this is something that Reb Nachman used to say, he says, the world says stories are meant to put people to sleep. But I say that stories are meant to wake us up. And I want to say that this week on Sunday was my rabbi, Reb Shlomo Carlebach's 20th yahrzeit. He left this world 20 years ago. And one of the most amazing things that Shlomo taught was he taught amazing Torah. He sang amazing songs. But one of the beautiful things that Shlomo brought down into the world was the art of telling stories. He believed in stories. He told stories because he understood that through telling stories something happens. And that's what he did. He went around the world and told stories. I remember as a kid hearing so many of his stories. And I remember times in my life when people asked me something and I'd say, I would try finding the right ism or the right ideal that I'm standing for. And at the end I would just say, let me tell you a story. Because when we hear a story, something happens. And we take humongous steps without even understanding. Maybe in the words of Reb Shlomo, I'll just read something from a book called Lamed Vav. Everything we understand derives from our consciousness, but a story comes from a higher place, from our imagination. And not only that, stories seem simple. They seem just to be giving over a tale, an event. They seem clear. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But as we listen or read, we realize that stories have many levels, many layers of meaning. They're strange and familiar at the same time. So Shlomo, in this beautiful teaching of his, is showing us what it actually means to take shortcuts in our life. To read stories, to hear stories, and to tell stories is the exact way that we make these powerful shortcuts to get from one side of the earth to the other. Shabbat Shalom.